Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 1. Progeny of Hate. Chapter 23. Captured. Fengor lowered his cup almost reluctantly. The exquisite fruity flavor of the Pernacum wine lingered sweetly on his tongue, even as the potency of it spread tingling through the chest cavity and out to the extremities of his frame. Such an elixir was almost too good for a mortal man to consume, and certainly not meant for one of lesser rank than a king. This eve of the harvest festival an added enticement lurked in the pick of his neighbor's produce, the thought that the wines of Pernacum would shortly be his, the first fruits of ambition, a blessing on the gods, and on their mouthpiece the high quester, for the life of Fengor Seth Albarad would not end in shallows. The embarrassments of the past, the errors of judgment, the wrong choices, all would soon be swallowed in the triumph of conquest. He allowed his gaze to travel over the nobles of Nuria, here at table with their sovereign, selected for their influence and power, their usefulness. He smiled inwardly at the wary faces of the men from Gilreth. Let them sit with their small suspicions. Nurian destiny would march on despite their reluctance. Unconsciously, he raised the cup again. He half longed for the formalities of the festival to be over, so that he might yield himself completely to its not-so-subtle invitation. There was so much to celebrate. The harvest had been a good one, and had given him ample supplies with which to buy the approval of the Ligurian people. That fool Teoric would not long sit comfortably on the throne he was stealing from Gregoran. The fabled greed of the Ligurian merchants had already induced them to sell the greater part of their crops to Terralan. Famine would set in before the coming of Genesis. Then the full storehouses of Nuria would only open at a great price, and if further persuasion were needed, he had Malvor and the soldiers in Lysan, where the inept Ligurian governor had already departed, and Nuria's obedient guard captain would soon take control. On the edges of his reverie a disturbance was growing. Nothing had changed in the hall, yet he was forced to abandon the pleasures of his daydreaming and focus his full attention on the rowdy guests and scurrying servants, as if their everyday actions suddenly held a threat he had not noticed before. At the same time, he felt a slight sickness steal over him, gradually turning his limbs to lead. A horrible suspicion tugged at his mind, and his eyes searched almost frantically for the chamberlain. Had he been poisoned? Had someone managed to bribe the fanatically loyal Gwir into betraying his master? He shook his head in an attempt to clear it, and stole a glance at the Count of Gilreth and his son. Would they dare stoop to such treachery? They certainly did not possess the nerve. Moreover, they were not even looking in his direction, but had their heads turned towards the tall double doors of the main entrance. Would they not have watched him like hawks to spot the first signs of their plot coming to fruition? He had been imbibing the Pernacum brew for more than an hour. The king cast his heavy glance this way and that in the hall. More and more heads were turning towards the entrance, fearfully, expectantly. The boisterous conversations and jesting faded gradually, till even the most besotted reveler had ceased his chuckles and merely sat staring in the direction of the doors. What was happening out there? Did the others feel the same odd sensation that had robbed him of motion? Fengor made an effort to beckon to the guard standing just inside the doorway, only to realize with horror that they were stricken with the same debilitating curse as he. Their eyes gazed at him in dumb surprise, as if they were caught in a dream, and he alone could wake them from it. Yet instead of waking, they were steadily dragged deeper into it. Everyone was staring at the doorway now, some open-mouthed, all perturbed and ill at ease. The man moved slowly and laboriously, as if wading through a stream. The strain of it could be seen clearly on his furrowed brow and the determined set of his mouth. Though apparently inhibiting his freedom of movement, the pool spilled with him into the room, spreading around, reaching into the furthest corners. The door guards, unable still to move of their own accord, found themselves drawn into the wake of this wading nonetheless, like dead leaves of grey cast caught in a sudden breeze. Once he had passed them, they drifted closer to each other, involuntarily forming a retinue behind him. He was old, this stranger, and stooped over, but his Viran eyes blazed with authority. Fingor fought the rising fear with all his might. He squirmed against the paralyzing sorceries of the intruder and forced his lips to part. His voice came out in little more than a whisper.
"Stay, old man. Approach no further."
Oddly, the weak words had their desired effect. As if this token resistance had added to the strain of waiting, the man took a last halting step and froze. He straightened his shoulders, while the entire room flinched in anticipation of his voice. Power, demanding instant and unwavering obedience, holding the mind in dreadful awe, flowed out from his dingy robes and crooked figure.
"Do I owe you allegiance, son of Elberad, whose time I saw come and go as a disease?"
The voice was deep and strong, the words pronounced with deliberate care. None could mistake their meaning. Every last head wanted to turn away from this buffeting wind. Fengor felt the wild anger rise in him, and Talon grasped the fastenings of his ornate girdle, as if this would strengthen his failing resolve.
"Treason!"
He wanted to shout, but cold fingers pressed down on his chest.
"Where is your brother, King? And what have you done with his wife?"
There was a scuffle as Fengor rose to his feet. His face was ashen. The guards still seemed unable to obey. The air was heavy with foreboding and fear.
"Silence that man!"
The voice raged on as if the mandate of a god.
"Why have you turned the first wild honey into weeping dew?
Now the finger pointed directly at Talon.
Were you not charged to protect? Yet the sword of glass is turned to dust."
The High Quester fought against the weakness in his limbs and the numbness in his throat.
"Sorcery!"
He croaked, and twisted in his seat with rolling eyes.
"Who are you, traitor, to bring such blasphemy before your king?"
A slight smile curved the stranger's mouth.
"My name is of no import, save to serve you in disregarding the truth of what I say. I am sight and certainty. I touch the sighing of the wind and patterning of the rain. My role does not shift without the echoes of it traveling to my doorstep. My name is Willen of Store, one who has not forgotten. You are insane and filled with the curses of sorcery."
Talon raised a shaking hand, feeling himself once more on familiar territory. Willen of Store paid no attention to him.
"Rave on, impostor. Your raving is at an end. Your plotting has delivered Vir's children to their death, and the deceiver has played you false. Now you will beg for the old ways, and you will curse the chains of blind custom."
He turned to Fengor once more. The king had slumped back into his seat.
"I am here to speak your doom, Fengor, saith Elberad, yours and your people's, for none of you have merited the name you have denied but still carry. And so the gods will not speak for you. No one will take your part when you sink into the dark. Do not call for aid. There is none to answer. You have become a vile thing among the honorable, a fool among the wise. You must be cast out, you and the ones who follow your weakness. Your enemies rise numberless among your so-called friends. Your blindness has betrayed you.
A low moan of anger rose in Fengor's throat, till it escaped him in a violent rush. All he wanted was to close his fingers round the throat of the one who had dared utter such words in his presence. Yet his bellow of rage did not deter its subject in the least. The old man turned away to face Talon.
Let it be known that this is the last of your profane cleansing. If the Viran are to cheat their fate, none of your cheap trickery will survive, and the poison of your mockery of a faith will be drawn from their hearts and minds. Renounce your evil pretenses and embrace the forsaken art.
At last the old man's energy seemed spent, and he slumped forward on his stick.
Hold your tongue, you fool! You are a dead man!
Fengor's voice was high-pitched and hoarse, like that of a madman. There was a collective gasp from many throats, as if their masters had surfaced after a taxing swim. All but the High Quester and King seemed reluctant or unable still to speak. As Willin turned to leave the hall, they felt again the tightening of his grip. No one moved to block his way. He halted for a moment in the doorway. Turning back, he spoke his parting words in resigned, sad tones.
We are, all of us, dead men.
For a moment his gaze lingered on Count Byrand and Garolaine of Gilreth. Then he was gone. Such was the confusion and awe at what had transpired in front of them, that not a single person considered pursuing the villain. Fengor's guests looked at one another and their king with wide-eyed consternation. Not in living memory had such an open and powerful demonstration of the art been witnessed. Every heart still quivered at the potency of it. Fengor and Talon both knew that something had to be done immediately to restore their authority. Both searched for the words to discredit what the people had seen, to paint the happenings in shades of wickedness, and turn the situation to their advantage. For the king, it was difficult to find an argument that would defeat such potent demonstration, and he reached for his cup instead. There was little to inspire here, though. For all its sweetness of before, he might have been sipping vinegar. In the end it was left to the High Quester to make an attempt, and though his voice was a little unsteady at first, it took only a while for him to slip into the channels of old custom. The trembling in his hand ceased. The Order of Nuria would not crumble before mere words, even when they were supported by the wiles of sorcery.
What did you think I would achieve in Gilreth? Why did you have me run the risk of discovery?
There was little accusation in Rune's tone, but much curiosity. Garth studied the man in front of him with a furrowed brow. How he despised the trading of cunning words. How he longed to be able to speak everything that was in his mind, to unveil his plans and intentions without fear of the other's motives. Yet, for the moment, he would have to bait his hook with care. He put on the mask of the all-wise diplomat.
I have mentioned to you before, Lord Rune, that your tenacity and even triumph during a state of exile has won respect in many circles. Moreover, you are still a Viron prince, whether denied your heritage or not. The mere fact that you deliver a message lends it equal weight to the seal of Lord Karth. You are of more value to me than you suspect.
My name is a byword in Nuria and Ligerium. In the marshlands in the south I am a stranger, in Erin an enemy, and in Track a guest with his welcome spent.
The Viron snorted in disgust.
Your seclusion and enigmatic existence here on Hiran Inrath hardly creates a platform for political maneuvering. I am not fool enough to believe that you need me for diplomatic purposes.
That is true, though you have seen only the beginnings of what is hidden beneath the surface scheming of the lords around the inland sea. In time, I may require other services from you.
Rune grinned at the older man, itching to shout at him to stop the charades and politics, and for once speak the plain and simple truth. He marveled at the same time that he could have forced the other onto the defensive so easily. The knowledge of Karth's secret letter had suddenly given him the edge. He knew better, though, than to reveal the fact that Byrand had shown it to him. He pressed his attack.
Tell me again, Lord Karth, why it is that you attempt to draw all these marginal powers into some sort of alliance.
The old man frowned heavily. What was this foolish prattle? Was the man out to misunderstand him deliberately? Or did he merely wish to provoke him into revealing some part of his plan? He sighed in mock exasperation.
You do not believe what I have told you before? Tell me plainly, Lord Rune, if there is some part of our bargain with which you are unhappy. You believe you run too many risks?
The running of risks is not what concerns me as much as the reasons for running them.
I perceive that you are still not convinced of the threat concealed in the southern lands.
Karth smiled as the other did not reply immediately.
I will not deny that I am disappointed, and yet it is only in exploring these heartlands of evil that you may discover this threat for yourself.
Rune's grin spread into a smile. He enjoyed being so sure of himself.
And while exploring, you may make use of me as a point of contact, you called it.
Quite so. Though that is not of primary importance anymore. It is useful. During your next trip you may be of inestimable value.
Karth turned away doubting eyes.
I have a certain dark dream, a painful vision, that ensnares me from time to time.
The old man's face was tired.
Among the many trees of Malik's southern realm are secrets kept from me, yet I can glimpse their nature dimly when he is preoccupied and the sun sits strong at midday. I can glimpse their nature.
More evil, I suppose?
Karth kept his temper in check with extreme difficulty.
Save your mockery for your equals. Why is it that you delight in damaging your reputation so? Is there any value in your folly? I do not play with words or meanings when I declare to you the intentions of that demon.
Rune regretted his silly remark, but pride would not let him concede that that was what it had been. How could he slip from the high ground so easily? Much of what he earnestly believed he now poured into his argument.
What is evil? Is it not evil to misuse a friend, ally, or even a servant to achieve your own noble ends?
The corners of his mouth had once more sunken into the etching of bitterness.
If you are so good, why don't you do your own dirty work?
Karth bit off his reply. He had sensed the inward struggle behind the other's words. This was more than a childish argument. He spoke with sincerity.
All who serve me, but you, do it out of gratitude and love.
Love?
Rune drew his cynical gaze into a cold stare.
You bind them to you with love, a cheap price for loyalty, and they die for you as martyrs to your cause. What do they have in return? mutilated bodies and cold graves.
No.
Garth dropped his gaze to the gnarled hands in his lap. His voice betrayed that he was not unaffected by what the other had said.
They live and strive and die in honor, in gallantry and respect, having somehow become greater than themselves, being elevated into purpose and ultimately into victory.
He looked up, his eyes bright and steady.
Their meaningless, dull lives are ennobled by a cause so much greater than domestic dreams. To some, it is atonement for ills they have inflicted before. To others, it is an escape from certain death, and a chance to work the same miracle for those as unfortunate as they.
And so you spend them like copper coins.
Rune slowly shook his head.
You'll have no such dedication from me. I will be paid the price I demand.
Garth did not reply, nor was there a spark of anger or disappointment in his expression. He merely gazed at the man in front of him, as if pondering what had been discussed. Only when the latter rose to go did he address him again.
I have no intention of cheating you out of your sweet revenge, if that is all that you want. But the fates have a way of twisting one's path in unexpected directions.
For a moment Rune lingered in the doorway. Uncertainty swilled round him, as it often did when he gave ear to the equivocal statements of the old man. It was never so much what was said that was disconcerting, but rather the strong suggestion that Rune was in possession of only a small part of truth, and his interpretation of it was childish and simplistic. Once more, Garth had succeeded in turning the firm soil of his certainty into quicksand. He gave no sign of it, though, as he smilingly stepped through the doorway. Lord Garth stared silently and wistfully out to sea from his perch on top of the tallest tower of his fortress. So many cycles had passed since he had painfully realized the truth about himself and his adversaries in Myril. What a price he had paid for his ignorance. The evils he had done could perhaps not be undone ever again, but that would not deter him now. He would cast what little power and influence remained to him into the fray. Yet he could not prevent the cold touch of despair at the thought of how unprepared he still was. Where were the armies to withstand the Dark One? Where was the strong arm that would strike down his monstrous form? How was it that the end had come so soon? A slight noise made him turn his head towards the stairwell. Behind him stood the young Virhan Hanek. Here was one with unquestioning love and loyalty, one who had grown strong in the fastness of fear. His halting voice betrayed his concern.
Pardon, my Lord Garth. Would you like to take some refreshment? The table is set.
Thank you, Hanek. I will be down shortly. Lord Rune has departed.
He has.
Garth looked up at the strange tone. A deep frown sat heavily on Hanek's brow.
Why do you send this bitter man on one mission after another? Do you not have better ambassadors than this outcast? You know his heart is in nothing he does for you.
And yours is, Hanek?
Garth smiled.
I know that he has no inkling of the severity of the threat from Nun Merrick, or the atrocities that will engulf us soon. That is why his heart is not with us. He does not understand. And that is why he has to see and experience all he can. He needs to wake from the slumbers of his hate. Something has to bring him back to life.
Do you need this man so much? Why not use one that is already living?
Do I need him?
The old man raised his eyebrow.
He is to be the sword in my hand.
It was a huge man, larger than any she had seen in the arena. He waded through her frightened guards like through a wheat field, scattering the stalks to the wind. Haldred watched him as if in a dream, this giant, who oddly did not seem intent on killing, and held back his strength when he struck down his opponents. Clearly, he meant only to immobilize and disable. A little hope broke through her fear. They had stepped out of the trees, flanking a narrow defile not half a day's march from Nicoma. The early morning fog still clung to the rutted roadway that had caused the unwary Ligurians almost to stumble right into the ambush. Even so, they had met the first assault with a determined clash of steel. Julos had been roused from his dark contemplations early enough to realize their peril and attempt a breakout. There was no room to turn the wagons. They had had to flee on foot. Julos had organized the stand in the clearing. His wife and son, with the other woman, had been shoved into the middle, while his men had formed a circle about them. All had worn the grim expressions of determination born of despair. Perhaps there would still be a chance to beat off the attack and make for Nicoma. Then the giant had come. Now all she could do was grip the shoulders of her son tightly, as the guards were whittled away around her. Should they not have tried, at least, to flee into the forest? The futility of their resistance became all too apparent, as more and more raiders appeared. Soon the clearing was alive with them. There had to be more than 200, pressing the defenders into a tight circle. Yet, for all the activity about her, Haldred could not take her eyes off the giant. He seemed strong as fate itself, which had dragged her to this place against her will, and now had her at its mercy. Julos leaped forward, the half-forgotten moves of the fencing hall reeling through his mind. He was no novice with the sword, but many cycles of neglect and heavy drinking had taken their toll. Nevertheless, he managed to pierce the giant's club arm with a well-aimed thrust, drawing a bellow of pain from the lumbering shape. Haldred could see the eyes narrow in hatred, as the instructions for moderate force evaporated from the dull mind. The full power of his club caught Julos on his leather-armored chest, knocking the wind out of him. He dropped his sword and sank to his knees. There was a gasp of horror. Haldred had no way of telling whether it had been hers or Arid's. A grunt of satisfaction rumbled from the big man. He drew back his bleeding arm for the death blow. Julos, his mouth gaping, had not breath enough to scream. The blow caught him on the side of his head, smashing the skull. His body twitched once or twice on the ground before lying still. An amazing calm had settled over Haldred. She became aware that all activity in the clearing had ceased. Not a single guard remained standing, though several had to have been taken alive. The governor of Lysan was no more. Despite the inevitable horrors in store for her, this was the only truth within her grasp. Her clasped hands, holding the stunned form of her son round the chest, were wet with his tears. For her part, there was just a strange quiet. Only later would she remember the guilty question in her mind, whether Julos had finally, heroically, and for the first time tried to defend her, or whether he had been solely occupied with saving his own life. Rough hands jolted her from the mesmerizing thought, shoving her without pity or consideration in the direction of their abandoned wagons. She managed to hold on to Arid, even when a savage tried to tear him away, and drag him with her into the middle of the group of frightened women now waiting at the rearmost of the wagons. The boy no longer cried, but she could feel the panicked grip on her arm and the quiver of his small body. She would fight to keep him close. The dead bodies, stripped of anything useful, were dragged away into the brush and left some distance from the road. Little effort was made at concealment. Wild animals would no doubt discover the corpses all too soon and leave traces all over the countryside. Haldred shuddered at the thought of her husband being accorded such treatment. Imran knew that she had imagined him dead ere this, but the manner of his passing left nothing but dismay, now that her thoughtless fancy had materialized. If she lived to keep a measure of sanity and length of days, often this scene would visit her in dreams. Suddenly, unsteady on her feet, she reached out to grasp the wooden side of a transport. With the greatest of efforts, she stayed the fainting foot. The others, 3 waiting women and 4 servants, regained a semblance of their composure when Haldred joined them. It seemed that the savages meant them no immediate harm, and despite their hopeless situation, they had found a measure of safety. Yet the dread's uncertainty kept reason and speculation from their minds, so that they pathetically believed that the mere presence of their mistress was somehow responsible for their reprieve. Haldred could sense some of this irrational need emanating from their wide-eyed staring. She could not meet their gaze. Instead, she studied the movement and appearance of their captors. If she was not to be misused or put to death immediately, she would watch for an opportunity to escape. Imran alone knew what their intentions were for the group of huddling women. She and her son could hope for eventual ransom if the wild men had any inkling who they were. For a frightening moment, she wondered what her father would do if he considered the price too high. 12 of the 30 guards had been killed outright. The remainder, in various states of injury, joined the handlers and male servants near the lead wagon. Here they were lashed together like cattle, strung out behind the wagon. 4 of the weakest were flung onto the boards from which the packages and chests had already been looted. Haldred noticed a group of raiders going through her clothing and personal belongings with blood-stained and dirty fingers. Helpless anger rose in her with such an intensity that she was surprised at it. There was a good deal of coarse laughter as some items were flung about and trampled in the road. The raiders were as diverse a crowd as she could have envisioned. Some had the villainous swagger and aspect she remembered from childhood imaginings, as if the tales told by the rhyme-song Fireside had come to life. Many boasted coppery skins, darkened by the desert sun, and loose garments worn in the south. There were more of the long-armed hulks, like the first giant she had seen, squatting together in the dirt, a tall marsh dweller standing over them like a guard. Worst by far were these last men from the swamplands, reeking of wild places and bogs, flitting here and there like shadows, their eyes cunning and hungry for something she could only guess at, but that made her shudder all the same. One of them caught her staring and flashed a mocking smile. His canines were overlong and sharp, as if he had shaped them thus for his own dark purpose. A shout of glee turned him away from her towards the middle wagon, where Julos wines had been discovered. Greedy hands passed down the skins as nearby men surged forward. The scuffle broke out among the press of bodies, with shouts and curses in many tongues, that to Haldred sounded like the snarling of dogs. Bellowing a command, a tall, bare-headed Physian stepped out from among the trees. His hair was neatly plaited, and his face beardless. The very quality of his attire set him apart from the others. His gaze, quick and piercing, silenced the men more effectively than his voice could have. Between the slightly stooping shoulders, his head reached forward on a slender neck, giving him the appearance of a vulture. Haldred's blood chilled at the sight of him. The baying pack dispersed at his approach. Several of the departing men concealed wineskins under arms or cloaks. Others lingered in the vicinity, their pleading looks revealing the deep thirst driving them. The Physian mounted the wagon with deliberate tardiness, looking this way and that in the fashion of a royal. He picked a wineskin with care, tucked it under his arm, and almost as an afterthought, toppled the chest to the ground with his foot. The contents spilled out, drinking vessels and bowls, cutlery, some of Julos' clothing. Haldred's grip tightened on the wooden planking of the wagon, but she did not notice it. Hot tears were staining her cheeks at last, in a mixture of humiliation, anger, and grief. Whatever Julos had sinned during his lifetime, he had not deserved such an end. To have the objects of his household rifled by this vulture, while his stripped and mutilated body had not turned cold as yet. She looked away, driving the scene from her mind. There was little time to mourn the dead. The raiders from the south were joined by an even greater force shortly before noon. They had several more captives with them, sorry-looking individuals who could only be recognized as farmers, traders, or soldiers by what remained of their clothing. These were added to the string of prisoners in their turn, slumping down in weariness as soon as they were tethered. Even as the newcomers swirled about her, Haldred became aware of several unsettling details. The group of men, now numbering close to 1,000, shared an easy familiarity. They were well accustomed to working together in this fashion. They were disciplined in their own wild way. There was purpose in their actions, and the wanton behavior she would associate with savages was mostly absent. Furthermore, there was no urgency in their manner. They strode about in a relaxed and casual way that reminded her of the peacetime guards in the garrisons of Amorous. The leaders had congregated in a shady spot, leaning against tree trunks, speaking in lazy undertones. Some had their eyes closed as if dozing. One would never have guessed, by looking at them, that mortal enemies were fewer than 10 miles away. These men expected no pursuit, that was quite certain. Would Tyric's men not find it easy to follow their trail? Were they not seasoned enough to realize this? Haldred glanced at the slouching sentries. Why did they linger in a place where there was danger for them? Who were these men, after all, and what were they doing in Lysan? They were not men from Breck, or any other town in the region, she was sure of that. How could they operate here without the support of the locals? How was it possible that the armies of Ligurium did not simply wipe them out? Something of Vengus' irrational warnings floated back to her. Horrible suspicions surfaced through the fog of uncertainty. Her late brother had seemed certain that death would find him in the forests of Lysan. Why had he not tried to escape it? Had he still had hope that his warnings would be heeded, that he could avert a disaster? But his death had vindicated his wild stories. There was a master behind all the mystery of recent events. If that master was the Lord of Nunmerik, he had many devoted acolytes in Ligurium. Could her father be involved? She felt something close to the panic she had experienced at the first sight of the giant. Would he have sacrificed his own son like that? And to what end? No, Tregoran had not the capacity for such treachery. Who then? The silent leaders, lounging in the shade, were suddenly animated by the instruction of a dark-skinned warrior. He had removed his battle mask to reveal the noble features of his Southland race, a large, aquiline nose flanked by high cheekbones. His eyes were set in confident power. Every movement expressed his authority. The vulture who had looted the wagon looked like a ragged crow in comparison. Men rose in sullen obedience to the barked orders, forming into columns, shouldering their array of armaments, wearily grasping the yokes of hand carts. Those who had been designated guards of the captives moved forward with snarls and curses to drive the wretches to their feet. Several hulks moved towards the woman and motioned with their spears for them to climb aboard the rearmost wagon. Haldred rose to her feet almost without thinking. Her mind was still set on earlier contemplations. She gripped her son absent-mindedly as they mounted the wagon with the other woman. There would be no attempt now to draw their attention to who she was, neither an offer of riches and ransom. She could not wait for the slow messages to reach her father. She would have to escape and hasten to warn him of his peril. The incredible warnings from his son Trigoran had failed to heed, had suddenly illuminated a face in the mind of his daughter, and one much closer than the lord of distant lakeside. Clear and unmistakable memories lined up as witnesses before the judge, the smiling arguments, the pronounced animosity towards Vengus, who, dear gods, he had sent to his death, this trusted adviser, the conqueror of Brek, the savior of Ligurium. Only one man had enough ambition to sacrifice all those Ligurian soldiers, a man whose mask she had seen slip shortly after the death of her brother, her cousin Teoric. In sharp contrast to their tardiness of earlier, the raiders seemed possessed with an insane urgency once they had started out. Perched on the wagon with the other woman, Haldred soon felt pity for the bound men marching behind. Some still carried the marks of their untended wounds, while many, especially the ones who had joined them later on, were obviously at the point of collapse. The marshlanders lashed the oxen mercilessly to keep them walking at a brisk pace. These animals did not belong to them, and they had no apparent need of them beyond this single journey. The lashings soon shifted to the hapless men. One by one they would stumble and pitch forward, dragging down several others with them when they fell. The fury of whooping would move away from the oxen for a few moments, allowing them to slow down into the usual trudge, and giving the wretches behind an opportunity to lift their fallen comrades to their feet again. Haldred wondered how long she could watch these grim proceedings without being sick. Then her eyes fell on Maris, right at the back of the line. He appeared to be unhurt, though his dull stare, like the others, was fixed on the dust of the roadway. Ere long they had to slow the pace or leave the captives behind. An overseer paced up and down the line once they had been forced to a halt, cursing roundly in his baying language, striking out at random with his whip, but powerless nonetheless to animate the sprawling men. There was some deliberation at this point among the commanders, during which the captives were fed and watered. Haldred noticed with relief that Maris was among the stronger of the men, and moved about as he could to aid others in imbibing food or water. All too soon they were forced to their feet once more. 2 large columns of men had moved off at a trot, and the rest of the raiders, with the captives in tow, set a gentler pace behind. A cloud of dust rose from the hundreds of stamping feet, and into it the columns soon vanished. Haldred felt a measure of relief at the sight of it. The vulture of earlier and the dark commander had disappeared with them. Mile followed weary mile. Once more they halted for water and a brief rest during the afternoon. But by the time Imran's orb had melted into amber clouds in the west, and the weary column left the main road to make camp, it was clear that even the strongest of the captives could go no further. As soon as the ox cart had rolled to a halt, they simply collapsed where they stood. Haldred signed to one of the guards to let her speak with the captain. He was weary enough to have lost some of his habitual malice, and took her in tow without a word. Though it pained her to leave Arid behind with the other woman, she had decided that she could no longer look on at the misery of the bound men without taking action. The marshland leader had a foul smell about him, and his manner was offensive in the extreme, but he spoke the track tongue well enough. In the end, he sneeringly agreed to her request to tend the wounded captives, and allowed her access to the chest of bed linen still perched on the second wagon. Armed with this concession, she was able to commandeer more water and food, as well as the help of the remaining woman. The soldiers, some hurt severely, were none the less better off than the farmhands and traders. These latter men had evidently suffered through another day like this before, and had had little energy in reserve. Maris stirred at the sight of her and the other woman. It even looked like he would protest to be served in this manner, directly or indirectly, by his mistress. He rose to his knees, ready to aid them in their task, but the guard who accompanied them motioned for him to sit down. He hesitated, looking at Haldred, and was shoved backwards onto his haunches by the guard's foot for his trouble. Haldred shot him a quick look of warning, as if to prevent him from doing anything rash. There would come a time for heroics, but at present there was little they could do. When they had done what they could for the worn-out men, she turned to the wounded ones on the wagon. One of the women had some experience in tending the hurts of animals, and she took the lead in caring for these men. Here and there she simply shook her head, and turned away to look at Haldred. The latter shrugged in helplessness. She could not perform miracles for these stricken creatures. While they were working in this somewhat hopeless manner, Haldred found her mind exploring the strangeness of it all. Did it really matter to the raiders if the captives lived or died? Why did they need these men at all? Were they merely being driven eastwards to be sold in a slave market? Would it not then make sense to keep them in good condition? But even more puzzling was the fact that they were still traveling along the main road to Breck. Surely they would leave the road sooner or later to make their escape unseen. But how could these raiders be so brazen as to travel abroad in Lysan during the day and in full view? Even if they were somehow in league with Turic, the Ligurian soldiers would attack them on sight, would they not? Unless they had been informed of the exact movements of the Ligurians beforehand. Later that evening, 3 more men were brought in and lashed to the line of captives. By their clothing, they were merchants, probably overtaken and captured by the columns of marching men. There was no sign of their stock or transports. This did not surprise Haldred, for she had witnessed the appetite for looting of the vulture and his like. She looked at the dejected newcomers with pity. They had no inkling of what lay in store for them the next day. 2 more days of steady walking brought them to the outskirts of Breck. They left the main road and trudged on through the dark on a badly marked track to bypass the city unobserved. The night air was cooler now than when she had first come to this outpost, and Haldred smiled to think how she had enjoyed the lamp-lit dark safety of the palace garden not too long before. For a moment she saw again the flashing blades of the furious duel fought around her in the night. She was certainly in need of such a champion, or a band of them, right then. She thought of the messages and warnings sent, the secret interview. What would Lord Rune think if he knew of her fate? Would he even care? The greater part of her whirling thoughts was sure that he would. Her mind turned to Malvor. He was in Breck, with several hundred Nurian soldiers. What cruel irony was making her pass by within a mile of such aid? Yet some warning checked her enthusiastic longing. Turic and his schemes would probably make even this city an unsafe place for her. What she had experienced of the Nurian captain, though, had not painted him in the colors of a traitor. No, he was certainly the dupe of more powerful men. Men like Prince Lucane, who would shove him here and there on the great map of their ambitions. Jostling this way and that, trapped in the rough motion of the cart, Haldred realized how much her thinking had patterned to that of her brother. At last she needed no more convincing of the menace permeating her world, and for her, as it had been for him, it was now too late to escape. The wagons halted but 5 miles distant from Breck. If anything, the audacity of the raiders had increased at the proximity of the city and its garrison. Haldred could make out mocking glances and threats aimed in the direction of the Nurians and their stronghold. Cooking fires were lit as before, though the men were cautious enough to shield them. There was little noise compared to the previous nights. It had become routine for the woman to tend the wounded as soon as the opportunity arose every evening, especially since 2 of the more severely hurt men had died during the 2nd day's march, and their bodies had had to be discarded along the way. The raiders wanted these men alive, for whatever purpose, and regarded the woman's interference as a benefit. Haldred moved with the others, but tonight her mind was not on her work. The guards, tired and hungry, had neglected to accompany them, and rather kept an eye on them from where they sat around their fires. Haldred's pulse had quickened at this realization. With Breck so close, this would be the perfect opportunity for escape. Malvor's men would catch up to this lumbering column ere long, and the remaining prisoners would be freed. She had fretted over leaving Arid behind when she would make the attempt, but now they would be separated for only a short while, if all went well. The 3 wagons had been drawn together to be used as shelter for the firelight, and were in full view of most of the camp. Haldred busied herself near the last wagon, gradually working her way round to the deep shadow of the lee side. Her heart was pounding so loudly, and her hands shaking so badly, that she was sure to be discovered if someone would just look at her. But the men were busy over their pots, or searching for places to bed down comfortably. One of the leaders was calling out names for the first sentry duty. Holding her breath, Haldred stepped round the wagon and crouched down. Nothing happened. There was no angry shout or hurrying footsteps. Her moment had come. The tall grasses, yellowed and dry, rustled at her passing in the windless night, and forced her to make painstakingly slow progress at first. She could not risk even a crouching run, for Lauren's eyes stared down with malevolent illumination on her path, and the sentries would soon be in place. How unfortunate that she had chosen the cream-colored sleeveless gown and a white linen shift to wear while traveling. If she had only been able to secure a dark cloak or wrap. She snaked through the grass, over the uneven ground at the side of the road, her skin crawling with anticipation. How far before she could take to her heels down the track? 100 yards? 2? How far out would the sentries be posted? It mattered not, she told herself. She would be beyond their reach by the time they had grumbled their way to their posts. A shallow ditch ran along the side of the road. Haldred followed it, till her eagerness judged the distance between herself and the camp sufficient. She glanced back just once, before hitching up her gown and setting off down the road at a steady run. She thanked Imran for her dislike of the heavy-heeled shoes of court, for she could not imagine having to run any distance in those. She could not have selected any better than the flat, serviceable leather ones she had on. Unaccustomed as she was to such activity, Haldred soon felt the running taking its toll. She had hardly gone a mile before her breath came in gasps, and she had a stitch in her side. If only there was some traveler upon the road who could aid her in reaching Breck at a quicker pace. She had had no supper and felt faint after the long day. Cursing her weakness, she slowed to a walk. Not for the last time, she wondered where the heroes were when one had such need of them. Vengis was dead. Julos, too. Her father and Lord Rune were out of reach. Turik was a traitor, and Captain Malvor on the far side of this dark gulf she had such trouble to cross. An hour passed like an eternity before she glimpsed the lights of the city walls. The track she was on had crested a rise barely 500 yards from the northern gate, through which she and Julos had made their entrance to Breck more than 2 seasons before. It did not lead directly to the gate, however, but turned away to the main road to join it perhaps half a mile from the wall. She chafed at this detour when the city was so close, but it would be more difficult going if she were to leave the track and beat across country. Shrubs and stunted trees commingled down the hillside and would delay her passage. A sudden noise brought her up short. She crouched instinctively and peered back the way she had come. Long moments passed, while she ached to break into a mad run for the gate. She turned away, slowly rising to her feet. Could it have been her imagination? She was too close to fail now. There it was again. An unmistakable human call pierced through the dark behind her. They had discovered her absence. Now there was nothing for it. She could not risk the open road, for her pursuers would surely spot her and catch up. She plunged into the thicket of leafy branches and struggled to fight her way through. The thorny fingers tore at her clothes, maddeningly holding her back, though she could have screamed at them to let her go. Precious moments slipped away before she could break through the hateful hedge and stumble, half falling down into the dell beyond. The darkness among the shrubs here was complete. If they had not heard her frantic movements, she should perhaps linger here to let them pass. With luck, they would believe she had reached the city already and turned back for the camp. Too loudly pulsed the beats of her heart, so that she could hardly hear anything above the din. She was crouching down again, frozen in place, yet ready to leap away at the first sign of discovery. Should she wait and let them pass, or had they already sighted their prey? It was impossible to tell. Through the thicket of leaves, a shape moved to block out the stars. Slowly, painstakingly, a hand parted the brush. A head appeared, just as carefully, to peer down at her hiding place. Imran's breath. Did they know? Why were they playing with her? Tense moments passed before the hand and head were retracted. She heard a voice speaking in low tones and a muffled exclamation. There was a sharp, urgent response, in which she could clearly make out the words, "City Gate." More words followed, but faded as the talkers moved off. They had decided to seek her on the track. Quickly now, she breathed to herself, to beat them to the gate. If she could get within hailing distance of the wall, it might be enough. Push through the brush, twist free as quietly as possible, crouch low over the brow of the next rise. The advance was far too slow for the urgency she felt. She glanced at the roadway when she had an opportunity, but it appeared deserted. Panic surged through her mind, and she headed recklessly down the slope, heedless of noise or danger. Near the bottom it happened. A dark tuft of grass gave way beneath her foot as she stepped into the hollow of some small animal's lair. She was down on hands and knees, the crash of her fall ominously loud in her ears. Only the smallest of cries she uttered, little more than a whimper, at the sudden stabbing pain in her twisted ankle. Almost simultaneously, the figure of a man shot from the bushes just ahead of her. Grabbing her by the arm, he yanked her to her feet with frightening strength. Haldred struggled against the grip for all she was worth, all the while calling for help at the top of her voice. "Shut up, stupid wench!" A dirty hand closed on her mouth, smelling of days-old grease and wilted onions. Her stomach lurched, but she bit it nonetheless. A strangled cry of pain and surprise gave her courage to draw another breath and shout again. Surely the city guards would hear and come to her aid. But she never had the chance. The blow caught her on the side of the head, and she had not time even to comprehend the sick pain of it before the world went dark and silent. "Keep up!" The marshlander violently pulled on the rope, making Haldred lurch forward.
"Let me have some water."
How annoying it was that her voice betrayed her fear of him. But the dull, dizzy throb in her temples, the sharp complaint when she stepped on her ankle, and the by now nagging thirst had combined to tear away the last shreds of courage. He turned on her, sensing her weakness, and reached for the brutal whip at his belt. A hand belonging to his Phesian companion closed on his arm.
"Don't spoil this one. She's meant for Heckanseer."
The man turned away reluctantly.
He does not even know she exists. If we had not caught up with her,
Be sure he knows. The captains would have boasted of her capture. If we had not caught up with her, we would have tasted his displeasure.
Armed with this knowledge, Haldred refused to go another step when they reached the site of the overnight camp. Though morning was but a suggestion on the horizon, the place was already deserted. Evidently, the leaders had thought it prudent to move the camp further away from Breck, in case the runaway had managed to reach the city. She had expected the comfort of the wagon, a meal and some rest, but these things had slipped away with the departed column into the night. No threat from the filthy swamp dweller could make her worn-out body obey, however, and the three of them had to spend a fretful hour there. Great was her relief shortly after sunrise, when a group of 20 raiders appeared with an empty wagon. Warned of her recapture, they had been sent back to fetch her and follow with all haste. Haldred was surprised at such treatment, and suppose their identity had to be known after all. Would there be no ransom demand then? What was their business with her? There was no sign of the other wagons and men that day, or for any of the remaining days of their journey. It pained Haldred to think of her son, alone and frightened, wondering if she was still alive. Certainly the other woman had to have guessed that the wagon had been sent back for her, and that she was therefore not dead. They would reassure the boy. Her puzzlement increased at each passing day. They traversed the whole of Lysan, leaving behind the last large settlement of Teppan, the grassy hills, the marked roadways. Even the mountains of eastern Lysan and Estium were fading out of sight. The tall, barren silhouettes of new mountains appeared to the west, and endless staring flatlands of stone and sterile dirt rolled away to the east. Haldred had seen maps of Myril as a child, and half remembered the empty sweep north of the Fez Desert, the waste her tutors had labeled it, an unexplored, unwanted stretch of no good earth that no one had any reason to pass through. A feeling of uneasiness that had nothing to do with her fear or predicament, and had been born at the first strange encounter with the raiders, now pushed itself to the fore. She looked at the cloudless blue of the empty sky, the trudging silence of her captors, and her apprehension multiplied with every mile. Long before she smelled the rotting odor of the hatching pools, or saw the canvas city stirring in the breeze. Long before she heard the snap and snarl from the uncountable horrors, or the pleading cries of the slaves gathered in droves to feed them, Haldred understood with terrible certainty that the very scourge Vengis had foreseen and had pleaded with her to flee from now loomed somewhere ahead of her in this wasteland. Evrain raised his hand to shield his eyes from the setting sun. For the first time this day, he dared smile to himself, despite the strong, heavy lines of the 3 slaver galleys set off against the deepening yellow of the skyline. For the greater part of the afternoon watch, the Sunsway had steadily outstripped the lumbering hulks, even in the light breeze, and with the deck swamped with silverbacks. Soon darkness would swallow them, and they could attempt to work their way round the slavers and head back to Kiel. The 3 had swooped down upon the Aranite fishing boats just before midday, having ventured out further than usual to claim a share of the silverback run. Evrain and his crew were several hours from shore. In the excitement of the catch, they had not noticed the lurking vultures until they were a mere 300 yards away. The fishermen had scattered in what had seemed to be a practiced maneuver, with Evrain's men making for the swiftest line downwind, although it was not an altogether strange occurrence for slavers to hunt this close to the coast of Aran, and rumor had it that many sailors believed lost at sea and drowned had fetched up in some eastern slave market. All aboard the Sunsway knew what these pirates were really after. There was little surprise when the attacking vessels ignored all the other craft and plowed straight after the flying captain of Kiel. Evrain glanced back at Gareth, still a little flushed and concerned as he huddled in the stern. Had he been a fool to give in to the boy's pleas that morning? Would it not have been better for all had he turned a deaf ear? Now there was peril for his crew as well, for the slavers would not let any escape should they catch up to the Sunsway. He was surprised again at the vehemence of the pirates' attacks. They certainly risked open war with Aaron, with so many witnesses about, yet still charged in as if their lives were at stake. What had they to gain from the death of this child? Tall plumes of cloud were massing to the east, as the sun at last disappeared into the sea. Evrain whispered his instructions to Lur, who in turn motioned to the crew in silence, as if the merest sounds might be overheard by their pursuers. It was odd enough that the slavers would chance on them in such a fashion as they had that morning. Could the spies in Kiel have relayed information that quickly? And now that they were between the Aaronites and their home, it was a much more difficult task to give them the slip. Even as the Sunsway tacked in a southwesterly direction, lights were kindled on the decks and masts of the galleys. They seemed closer in the near dark, beacons of bright threat. Their captains knew that Evrain would have to attempt rounding their flank sooner or later. They also knew he would probably do it in the dark. If he closed the gap between them too rapidly, an opportunity would present itself for them to catch up with the use of oars. He would be beating into the southerly wind, a much easier prey. Evrain saw the gaps between the galleys widening. They were stretching out their line to make it more difficult to outflank them. It would be a long and taxing haul to move around the westernmost vessel. Perchance, if they overextended, he could try to slip between them. He was a good 13 miles from Kiel already, and uncomfortably close to the dangers of the Witch Sea. This stretch of water round the Isle of Heron-Inrath teemed with uncharted shallows and reefs, vicious currents and sudden squalls. An impenetrable sea mist might blanket the water for days, till the most seasoned sailor had lost his bearings. There were many tales of how seamen had leaped screaming into the sea after many days of becalmed isolation, striking out in any direction for land, merely to be taken by the sharks circling their boats. There were worse stories of monsters that inhabited only these dreary waters, and would surface in their hundreds on a foggy night. Whatever perils he would face in the Witch Sea were preferable to the fate they would suffer at the hands of the slavers. Even if he had to cruise for several miles on the borders of this dismal place, the possibility of disaster could not compare to the certainty behind. The wind slackened somewhat during the night. Evrain could find no convenient place to alter his course and be sure of escape. The bank of cloud closed in from the east, sitting right on the water in places, though not even Gareth's keen eyes could pick out the lights of the slavers anymore. It would be madness to change course now, and though they were moving further from home all the time, Evrain could do little but sail steadily towards the south. The morning was gray and gloomy. There was no threat from the elements, like a brewing storm or hurricane, but an all-pervading quiet forced on everything and everyone, while the clammy cloak of fog draped over the ocean. Hardly a ripple broke the glassy surface around them, and no breath of wind stirred. The men spoke in wide-eyed whispers and nods, as if in awe of the unnatural atmosphere. There was no reason to hoist more sail, or even use the oars in an effort to steer the boat to safety and familiar places, since it was impossible to determine in which direction they would be moving. There was no sign of the sun, but rather an eerie light seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, illuminating the grayness. Evrain was uneasy without knowing why. The silverbacks filling almost half his boat stared at him with dull, lifeless eyes, as if in mute accusation, and not for the first time he sensed the sea as an immense, live thing under him. A being that commanded respect it was, that could exact sudden payment for the richness of its harvest. He ran his fingers almost nostalgically over the smooth wooden gunwale, as if for the last time, and suddenly he was afraid. Lur and the two crewmen, Melor and Yulan, had settled down in uneasy silence, trying to hide the gnawing anxiety. Gareth busied himself with the dragnets, though there was hardly anything that needed attention. He seemed unperturbed, but he failed to meet Evrain's eye when the latter glanced in his direction. Everyone had donned their blue-striped reins since the previous night, when the fresh southwesterly breeze had allowed them to escape the slavers from track, for the air had grown chilly and remained that way despite the calm. Lur rolled his eyes when he spoke.
If I didn't know better, I would swear that we're lying in the Witch Sea itself. There's no natural fault this.
He opened his mouth to say more, but a look from Evrain silenced him. They stared at each other in wide-eyed horror. Then the others heard it too, a growing roar of a gust of wind or a heavy breaker bearing down on them from behind the veil of grey. The men were on their feet and shouting. Gareth dropped the nets and straightened up, gaping.
Brace yourselves!
It was Lur's frantic warning. There was hardly any time to heed. The gust fell on them like a hammer blow, all but capsizing the boat and snapping the mast like a dry stick. Melor was flung overboard, his shout lost in the tearing, screaming mayhem. The sea itself came alive, a foaming, bucking bull striving against its rider. The boat was awash in a moment, the fish and gear swirling around their bodies as they struggled to get a grip on the seats or broken stump where the mast had been. Gareth spluttered and gagged as the water filled his mouth and nostrils. Half blind, he struggled to grab hold of anything that would afford him a grip. The wood in his hands came free as the boat lurched and tilted wildly. He lost his balance and fell headlong over the side. The seawater was cool and quiet after the buffeting wind. It held him but a moment before he was back in the mad motion of the waves. The boat was already several yards off. As he watched, it started rising in what seemed a gigantic hillside of water. Soon he would be swept with it, up the precipice, and come crashing down. He hastily gulped air into his lungs and dived in a frenzied attempt to escape its clutches. Down and down he went, till he could see the bottom of the boat etched against the light from the surface. The water was much colder, and gripped his body as if to squeeze the breath from him. He saw the boat suddenly move up and away, and tried to think of the watermen, diving for glowing white orbs, endlessly scouring the sea bottom for riches. His breath was forcing its way between his clenched lips. It had a will of its own. His body was its prison, from which it was escaping in rushing silver bubbles. Only when the prickling in his scalp warned him of an impending blackout did he speed towards the surface. He broke it gasping, and found himself in a trough, walled by dirty greenish hillsides. The sky to the east had turned black as night. Thunderbolts came crashing through the murk, and soon the heavy drops of rain cascaded all about him. He had no idea in which direction the boat could be, if it had not already been swallowed by the sea. There was no way to find it, and his shouting would not be heard above the din of wind and water. Still he called out several times, though hardly hearing himself, before a towering wave bore him up, spluttering, to where he could glimpse the empty sea all round. Fear tugged at his mind, fear of being alone so far from land, and for the men who had been cast into these violent waters. He struggled out of the rain and let it float free. It would only hamper his efforts to stay afloat, and not protect him from the cold. He made sure to tighten the leather belt that still carried his sheath, and, miraculously, his gutting knife. The water seemed warmer at the surface, and he was unhurt. He still had a fighting chance. Neither the darkness nor the heavy downpour lasted long. In a short while, the towering wave subsided, and before the hour was out, he found himself in most familiar but unexpected circumstances. The fog had lifted. The gusty wind had given way to a light breeze, causing small foam-topped waves to fling their stinging spray into his eyes, and the sun shone from a clearing sky. There was no sign of the boat. He tried propelling his body out of the water to have a look around. Maybe Evrain or one of the others was close by, sharing the same plight. After a few attempts he gave up, and fell back into the water shivering. the breeze icy cold on his wet body. He satisfied himself with shouting their names a few times, pausing for a reply, but without success. The ocean seemed to have swallowed them alive, removing all trace that they had ever been. The wind pushed stronger and carried his cries away with it. He was alone. For lack of a direction to take, he struck out slowly the way the wind was driving him, southwards. It would be too much of a struggle to fight against it and the wavelets it was whipping up in support. He had barely gone 20 yards when he almost bumped into the jagged end of a wooden pole. As he embraced it in relief, his cheek touched a small silver disc nailed tightly onto the pole, a medallion from Aaron. It was the mast from Evrain's boat. He leaned his forehead against it as despair washed over him for the almost certain loss of a true friend and a good man. What cruel fate to steal from him so harshly yet again, and separate him from the home he had little hope of seeing again. Still, there was the mast to keep him afloat. Draping his arms over it, he pressed his cheek against the hard wood and closed his eyes. Let the freshening breeze take him where it would on his makeshift raft. This way, at least, he would not wear himself out. The old man looked about him with obsessive care. Though not a sprig of grass or a pebble seemed out of place, he knew that someone had entered the vale. The presence was not threatening as much as disturbing, for there was some potency here, though veiled heavily by uncertainty. Whoever had disturbed the place had had little purpose, almost as though it had transpired by accident. Perchance this accounted for the difficulty he had in finding the intruder. Even as he searched, the presence faded to the edges of perception, a mere glimmer, like the dancing reflection of a will-o'-the-wisp, hovering on the periphery of vision. Had he mistaken the warning in his mind for the tiny ebb of power that usually came with the twilight? Certainly not. Dusk had not yet trudged its murky way into the eastern sky, when the warning had grazed his watchful mind. Even if his fleshly senses had not witnessed the bright light of day, there was no doubting the whisper from the veil, the gentle plucking of the strings of instinct, honed by eons of guarding this avenue. In complete silence he paced towards the crossroads, keeping an eye on the tree-covered hills on either side of the pathway. He explored the paths ahead with his mind, feeling for the thoughts and purpose of the other mage, bracing himself instinctively for the touch of another, probably hostile will. He had fought too many battles in this place to enter unprepared. He halted at the stone marker, the disturbance still unexplained. Slowly, he reached his thoughts along the pathways to touch the gates, each still locked and barred. The presence had not stumbled in through any of these. His thoughts lingered for a while on the gate of Nun-Merrick and its barely concealed anomaly. He touched it carefully, like one would prod a sore tooth with one's tongue, fretting once more over the unrelenting threat of it. Something had been changed in the construct, there was no doubt. Something he could not uncover through the seals. He sighed away the age-old frustration and dropped his gaze to the ground. The clay of the path, the tufts of grass, the frame of hills and trees, the gray sky overhead, none had changed since the day of their shaping. And what a bright day that had been, filled with hope and goodwill. The entire realm had been bound together, not only by the veil, but by a common purpose and desire. He smiled to think how they had endeavored to combat the strange emptiness of the place, so that humans could travel through it too, without the numbing fear and uncertainty overthrowing their minds. Yet the unreality remained strong, especially to him who had played the leading role in its formation. That was part of its charm, he believed, for here he could detach himself more easily from the pressures and demands of Myril. Here the names he bore meant little, and the shame of his disgraceful deed lost its sting. Suddenly, potently, the intruding will bulged and flowered into view. A figure strode slowly, timidly, from among the trees. He knew at once that there was no threat here, for the size and manner of the person reassured him. He sat down on a stone and beckoned the figure towards him. The uncertain gait gave way to a confident stride. Prompted, it seemed, by eager curiosity, the child walked right up to him. It was a small boy. With a shock he saw the pale blue eyes with their black slits. It was a Viron child. He understood. This was no real will. No doubt it was a specter from the past, come to haunt and accuse. Seated as he was, the man's form no longer held any menace for the boy. There was even something welcoming to his expression, and a strong sense that here might be the comfort he so needed to find. The wrinkled, lined face and stooping shoulders hid unfathomable depths of wisdom and power. He halted a mere pace away, surprised at the sudden alarm in the eyes of the other. The voice, when it spoke, was cold and disembodied, reminding him of another he had heard on the hillside of snow.
Do you have a name?
The old man was looking at him intently. A little frown of curiosity furrowed his temple. He seemed very impatient. There was something urgent about his manner. He faded for a moment and then became clearer. As he spoke again, it was apparent from his tone that he expected an immediate answer.
Well, do you?
I'm sure I do.
His own voice was embarrassingly thin and shy.
And it happens to be?
The boy forced his mind to obey him, to become clear and focused. He gazed out over the forested slopes and searched above the treetops for a familiar yet unknown shape. Then he suddenly realized what was wrong with the place. There were no birds, no sounds, no wind, not even the buzzing of insects. He reached out a hand to touch the tall stone marker, as if he wanted to reassure himself that it was real. His reply was almost inaudible.
I do not remember.
A sudden scream filled the air, drawn out and sad, with a plaintive quality that set his teeth on edge. The veil faded at the sound of it, and only established itself again when the old man spoke.
Oh, but I remember.
He laughed softly as the boy stared at him in confusion.
Your name is Juris and Sithel, and the 80 kings before them, guarding jealously the destiny of Vir's children. How right you were to take this form, so much like the Forsaken Son. He sighed and brought his hands up to hide his face. He sat like that for a moment, then drew back his hands and glanced out at the boy as if he half expected him to have disappeared. You are not real, are you? You have stepped out of my dream. You are to show me my guilt and visit me with remorse. Why is it that you have lingered in my mind for so long before bringing my torment to this place?
The boy seemed confused again, even bewildered. The old man continued.
You do not understand. Of course not. How could you? You never understood and never will. That is part of my curse. What do you know of the pain I feel at the sight of you? What can you understand of the shame that you are my firstborn and not hers?
The scream was louder, like a lost soul forever wandering in hopeless search of rest. The old man noticed nothing, though, or seemed not to, yet his voice had faded into the distance, even as the gray sky gave way to blue. Something wet was touching his face, and it was suddenly cold. Gareth knew the sound, he was sure of it. His mind seemed slow and heavy, rising from slumber. The sun was warm upon his bare shoulders, but his body seemed locked in ice. The sound came again, plaintive and persistent. He rubbed a wet hand across his sun-warm face to banish the numbness, of the deep sleep that had ambushed him earlier. A gull was circling some distance above him, but at his stirring cried forlornly and headed away downwind. Gareth spent a moment wishing for wings, and another wishing for land, before he realized what the presence of the gull signified. He raised himself up in an instant, pressing down on the mast. There it was, directly in his path. He could make out the foaming of white waves upon the shore. The wind had to have pushed him shoreward while he had slept for the greater part of the day, for surely this was an afternoon sun warming his back. As hope came flooding in, the wind puffed once or twice and died down completely. Perhaps there was also an ocean current carrying him landward, but with the failing of the wind, he seemed to have lost all sense of motion and progress. A spasm shook his frame, and as though it was a signal, he started shivering uncontrollably. His teeth were chattering so loudly that he almost burst out laughing. It was no laughing matter, though, he told himself. He would soon have to leave the sea-water or perish from the cold. Now that the wind had withdrawn its aid, he would have to work his way to shore. Leaving the security of the waterlogged mast, he struck out energetically. The current was in his favor, for he made good progress. The shoreline, however, was further than his hope had placed it, and he soon had to slow his pace or become winded. He had barely gone halfway when his courage failed him. His arms seemed heavy as lead, and his breath was coming in gasps. He turned on his back, extending his arms and legs and forcing his body to relax, tilting back his head till the water closed about his ears and temples. He could float almost effortlessly and slow his drumming heart. Now he thought himself a fool for abandoning the mast. Harsh visions of Evrain's drowned son, even of Evrain and the others, themselves turned to floating corpses, drifted behind his closed lids. Panic made him strike out again for the faraway land. It was a grim crawl to the beach, and he had to rest several times to prevent his cramping muscles from failing him altogether. He almost cried with relief as his feet touched sand, and he could drag his aching body out of reach of the cold sea. Anik and Bjor strung their tall air bows and fitted the barbed arrows slowly and carefully. All the while they kept their eyes on the figure they had spotted crawling out of the waves onto Yura Beach. It seemed worn out and diminutive in size, but they were not in the habit of taking chances. The wind had died down entirely, and the afternoon sun was fading rapidly, taking with it the warmth of the early leaf-full day. They glanced at each other, and at a nod from Hanik, broke cover and waded through the knee-high dune grass towards the sea. The constant roar of the foaming ranks of breakers drowned out all other sound and covered their approach. The light was deceivingly dim, but Hanik could make out that it was a human boy, dressed only in the triangular breech clout the Aranite fishermen wore. The leather sheath dangling on his left thigh could contain little more than a gutting knife. He was barely half-grown, and seemed harmless enough, but an uncomfortable question was forming at the back of Hanik's mind concerning his being here on this beach alive when he had clearly been shipwrecked in the Witch Sea. Were there other crew members on the shore? And how was it that their terrible defenses could be so easily breached? At 20 paces he signaled Bjor to halt and keep his bow at the ready. This strange boy would be allowed no surprises. He approached at an angle to give Bjor a clear line to aim, and this seemed to draw the attention of the kneeling figure at last. Gareth gradually brought his racing heart and labored breathing under control. He moved the swollen tongue over his lips. The briny taste only aggravated his thirst. Seawater still dragged at his legs, and his hands had sunk into the sand up to the wrists. A movement towards his left caught his eye. He glanced up without moving his head. There were two men approaching, or one was approaching. The other had a bow almost as tall as himself leveled at him. They were dressed in dark greenish hooded tunics and hose, with black leather boots reaching the calves. The approaching man was only 15 paces off. Their expressions were set in clear intention to do him harm. Time seemed to slow for Gareth. He determined to jump to his feet and at least attempt to defend himself. At the same time, he reached for the fishing knife with his left hand, but it was twisted behind his leg and hard to pull free. All he had managed was to stagger to his feet when the rearmost of the men launched his arrow and the other halted and raised his bow. Anik saw the boy move with lightning speed. Here was deception indeed. He brought up his bow as Bjor's bowstring sang behind him. Momentarily he saw the wide, furtive eyes of the quarry. They held no fear, but only the resigned, half-pleading look of one condemned innocently on the gallows. The boy fell away to his right. The knife he had tried to draw was still in the sheath. Bjor was running up. Another arrow fitted. Anik grabbed him by the arm, his mouth still agape with disbelief. The boy was on his feet again. Both his hands were raised with the palms outwards. His voice was a gritty whisper.
Gunnar!
He was speaking the Nurian dialect. Bjor pulled away the bowstring, swearing under his breath. Anik found his own voice at last.
Hold!
Bjor's bowstring quivered with tension.
Come closer, boy. Slowly. Keep your hands where they are.
Anik saw with satisfaction the surprise his own Nurian words had engendered. The boy approached cautiously, shivering. Anik noticed that the eyes were fixed on him, and not Bjor's raised bow. He took hold of the boy's left shoulder, unsheathed the gutting knife, and tossed it into the sea. The skin under his fingers was icy cold.
Lower that bow. Our bee has no more sting.
First lash his wrists together. There's some devilry afoot here. There was still tension in the large man's voice.
You mean you've never missed your man at 20 paces before? Not even in the dark, eh?
Bjor relaxed enough to spit on the sand. I know of only one man who can move that fast, and I'm not quite sure he is a man.
What is your name, boy?
Anik used the leather thong to tie the unresisting boy's hands in front of him.
Neil,
He said in the same hoarse whisper.
have you any water? I perish from thirst.
Anik looked at him closely. The fair hair was tousled and caked with the drying salt water. The skin was tanned from many days on the open water, but his speech was wrong. This was no Aranite fisherman's brat. Then he noticed the eyes again. It was virtually dark now, but they still held some glowing reminder of the daylight. Tiny golden flecks floated around feline pupils. It was a dead giveaway.
Well, Neil, I'm Sparrow, and the friendly one over there is Nightingale. I most certainly have water, and you may have all you can drink, if you behave yourself. No running, hiding, or any such nonsense. My friend won't miss you again.
This last he said with a wink in the silent Bjor's direction. Anik attached another thong to the boy's lashed wrists to provide him with a makeshift leash. He motioned Gareth to follow and signaled to Bjor to bring up the rear. When they reached their packs, he allowed the shivering boy to empty the water skins and draped his own cloak over the naked shoulders. Despite his burning curiosity, he was willing to wait for the mystery to unfold once they reached Fur. Bjor would remain at the lookout post until their replacements arrived in the morning, but he would deliver this curiosity to Karth that very night. Before long he was forced to carry his prisoner, however. The boy kept stumbling in the dark along the unfamiliar trail, and eventually collapsed from sheer exhaustion. Anik removed the thongs from his wrists, but his attempts to revive him were in vain. At last he shouldered his burden with a sigh and plodded on towards the dark outer defenses of Fur. The fortress of Fur twisted itself round the highest point of Garth's Isle, with a turreted citadel crowning the very top of the hill. 2 outer walls ringed barracks, stables, smithies, and workshops in formidable defense. The newly constructed walls stood in stark contrast to the ancient stone heart of the citadel, which belonged to another era and exuded a certain steady power, an old and experienced warrior. A maze of passages twisted this way and that under the hill, connecting the fortress to hidden caves all along the coast. The spring pulsed within the walls, rhyme song or suntide, and given ample supplies, the small force could hold out for cycles against a horde. The burdened man made his way up to the citadel through a series of postern gates, under the curious glances of the guards. He was fumbling at his belt for a key outside the last of these when he felt his prisoner stir. Relieved in more than one way, he slid the burden off his shoulder and held him in the upright position when he swayed. The boy stared at him groggily, his eyes drawn into slits.
Where am I?
His eyes widened suddenly.
You are Nurian. Who are you? Where is this?
Hanik put a hand over the boy's mouth, and only removed it when he stood still.
We are about to enter the citadel.
He motioned to the gateway with his key in hand.
That's not what I meant. The citadel of what?
I know what you meant, and I think it better if you don't know. You think you are the only one with questions. I have many more than you do, I assure you. But you will have to wait till you see the master. He will decide what you should know, or whether you will survive the night.
Hanik broke off with the sudden change that had come over the boy. The puzzled face had become contorted with hatred and disgust. A shiver passed through the frame that had little to do with cold. Gareth's voice rose desperately, hysterically.
Kill me then! You and your king! I'd rather be dead with Riot than be his son!
His entire body was shaking violently. He had struggled so hard, so long to escape these horrors, and now so unfairly they had caught up with him.
Keep quiet, boy!
Hanik reached out to restrain him, but he shook free, leaving the cloak in the man's hands. He seemed to have lost all reason as he screamed up at the walls.
Talon! Here I am! Murder me too! But you will fall! You will be torn with all the others!
Stop it!
Hanik had recovered himself and was about to strike down the boy when he collapsed of his own accord onto his knees, bent double with his face in his hands. The man stood awkwardly over the trembling form for a moment, wondering what to do. Then he picked up the cloak and draped it over the miserable shape.
You can stop that. There is no king here, and that louse Talon is 600 miles away in Belruth. May he rot away to slime and dust.
He prodded the boy gently with his foot.
Come on, get up. You can stop that now. Didn't you hear what I said? No one is going to murder you.
Though he heard and comprehended the words, it was only with the utmost difficulty that Gareth could gain control over himself. He was still shaking when at last he raised his head to stare at the man.
You hate him too? And the king? You hate the king?
Hanik shrugged.
I do not hate him, as much as I despise him for a fool.
He kept his voice low and soothing, conscious not to set the boy off again. He reached out a hand to help him up.
Come on, it's getting cold out here.
The sea fog had stolen in with the darkness, and draped itself over Heron Inrath. Only the highest point of the citadel was still free from it, and it seemed that it would not be for long. To the east, Lauren's eyes were ringed with moisture. Despite the encroaching damp, the flags of the courtyard and inner passages of the citadel still carried a trace of the passing day's warmth. They felt smooth and comforting underneath Gareth's bare feet. He was immensely tired, and though his stomach cramped with hunger, he doubted whether he would have the energy to swallow one bite of food. The march behind Hanik passed in a haze. He was only dimly aware of the fine stonework in the columns and walls around. They passed through a hall of significant size, circumventing a small dais, crowned with a simple stone chair, to halt abruptly in front of a guarded doorway at the rear. At the sight of Hanik, the bearded guard stepped aside without a word, but he stared in open curiosity at the silent form trailing behind. Hanik kindled a torch as they entered the passage beyond. His shadow lengthened against the coarse stone of the walls. As they moved into the darkness, an odd smell of crumbling stone and dank earth closed in, though the passage was swept clean and free of dust. A low thrumming vibration, like an inaudible hum, seemed to grow in intensity as they progressed.
Do you feel that, boy?
Hanik's voice had dropped to a whisper. Behind him, Gareth was dragging his feet. At the question, he looked up, and his staring eyes answered.
There are times I hesitate to disturb the master, even with urgent business. This is such a time. The very stones seem inhabited by something tonight. Something I'd rather let sleep.
The torch flickered in the draught as he spoke. The boy looked at him with an odd eagerness in his eyes. The dried sea sand still clung to the side of his face. Gareth could feel the tightness round his throat, the familiar crawling along the spine. They had come to the end of a long stone passage, stairs worn and stained with the tread of countless feet, angled away towards the left, narrowing to a heavy metal-bound door. As his bare foot touched the first step, pinpricks washed from throat to temples. The familiar numbness followed in its wake. Hunnick's hand shook as he ensconced the torch at the bottom of the stairs. He hesitated only momentarily before vaulting up to the door and knocking loudly. Despite his apparent bravado, his subsequent wink back at Gareth betrayed his nervousness.
The bold approach.
His voice was a little shaky. Gareth felt his eyes lock on the doorway. He was standing on the bottom step as if frozen in place, the folds of Hunnick's dark cloak reaching from his shoulders to the flagstones. Something moved behind the door, and abruptly the prickling, numbing sensation ceased altogether.
Step inside, Hunnick.
The voice was firm and brittle all at once, a rhyme-song breath. Light spilled down the stairs as the heavy door swiveled open on complaining hinges. Hunnick was caught with his hand halfway to the latch. He cleared his throat and, motioning Gareth forward, stepped through the doorway.